She left after the divorce and didn't know that a new life would begin on her parents' floating island. See what happened when the storm broke the chains and the water decided to test their strength. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The forest road wound through a silence that seemed older than memory. It had rained the night before, and now the trees dripped with water that caught the faint light of morning. Elena Morris kept both hands on the steering wheel, driving slowly through the narrow path that led to the old pier. Her car was heavy with everything she had left from the city boxes of clothes, papers, her mother's old quilt, a small bag of baby things that she still couldn't look at without feeling her throat tighten. 6 months pregnant, she had begun to move carefully, as though each motion might unbalance the small world growing inside her. It had been 2 months since the divorce. The city she once loved had turned into a maze of noise and reminders, faces of people who knew too much, buildings she had passed hand in hand with a man who now lived somewhere else, with someone else. She had tried to stay, to pretend that strength was the same as endurance, but every morning she woke up to silence that felt more like accusation than peace. When her mother called from the island and said, "There's room here if you need to rest," Elena had agreed without hesitation. Now, as the forest pressed in around her, she wasn't sure if she was running toward something or away. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the car. Somewhere beyond the trees, water was moving, the same lake where she had learned to swim when she was 8, before her parents sold their house and disappeared into the wilderness. She hadn't seen them in years. They had visited her once in the city, both of them weathered and lean, with faces browned by sun and wind. Her mother had told her proudly about the floating house they were building with other families, an entire island that could move with the wind, but still feel like home. Elena had smiled politely, embarrassed by the thought of her parents living like pioneers. Now, she would have given anything for that simplicity. When the trees finally opened, the lake appeared dark and still under the cloudy light. The pier was half hidden by reeds, its boards slick with moss. A small aluminum boat waited, tied to a crooked post, her father's boat. Seeing it sent a strange shiver through her. It looked smaller than she remembered, more fragile, but it was real. She parked the car, stepped out carefully, and felt the cold air settle around her like a reminder that this place belonged to another kind of time. The motor sputtered when she tried to start it, coughing and dying twice before catching with a rattle. The noise startled a flock of ducks that lifted into the air, wings flashing over the water. Elena sat still for a moment, breathing the scent of gasoline and pine, and let the sound of the engine fill her chest. It was rough, uneven, but it worked, just like her heartbeat lately. She untied the rope and pushed off, the boat gliding forward, cutting a pale wake across the mirror of the lake. The island appeared slowly through the thin mist. From a distance, it looked like a patch of color against the dark water. A cluster of houses built on wooden platforms, connected by narrow walkways. Tiny gardens spilled over the edges. Solar panels gleamed faintly. Smoke rose from one of the chimneys. It was smaller than she'd imagined, but full of life, as if the lake itself had allowed these people to borrow a piece of its surface. The closer she got, the more she saw greenhouses made from glass and plastic, wind chimes swaying above doorways, a line of fishing nets drying in the cold air. It didn't look like a refuge so much as a secret world. Her parents were waiting at the dock when she arrived. Her mother, May, stood in her rubber boots, with her gray hair tied back in a loose braid. Her father, Harold, held a rope in one hand and waved with the other. They looked older than she expected. Thinner, their faces marked by the weather, but there was strength in them still. Harold took the rope and tied the boat with slow, practiced hands, while May reached out and touched Alina's arm. It wasn't a hug at first, just a touch, light and steady, like a test of reality. Then May pulled her close, and for a moment Alina felt small again, like the child who had once followed her parents through the woods, collecting pine cones. Inside, the house smelled of smoke and salt. The walls were paneled with worn cedar, the windows covered with curtains made from old cloth. Everything was handmade. The shelves, the lamps, even the chairs that creaked under weight. A kettle hummed on the stove. Her father poured tea into clay mugs, while her mother sliced bread that looked dense and uneven but smelled heavenly. They talked quietly, their voices overlapping in the way of people who had lived together too long to need full sentences. Alina listened, answering when necessary, letting the rhythm of their words wash over her. When she finally set down her cup, she noticed the faint sway beneath her feet. The entire floor moved gently, like the deck of a boat. It wasn't unsettling, more like a heartbeat under the wood. Her father smiled when he saw her notice. "You never quite stop feeling it," he said. "Even after all these years. Reminds you that nothing here is fixed." That night, as she lay in the small room her parents had prepared for her, she listened to the sounds of the lake. Water lapped against the floats, and somewhere outside, a wind chime whispered. Her hand rested on her stomach. The child inside her shifted, a small pulse of life that felt more certain than anything else. The city seemed impossibly far away, as though it belonged to someone else's story. The next morning began with footsteps above the floorboards and the clatter of tools. Through the window, she saw her father on one of the connecting platforms, tightening a chain that held their home in place. Across the narrow channel of water, another platform floated, a small house with a red roof, smoke rising from its chimney. People were already moving about, carrying baskets, adjusting nets. She realized, with a flicker of surprise, that there were several families here. Her mother noticed her gaze. "They've all been with us from the start," she said, placing a steaming bowl of porridge on the table. "We built this place together, plank by plank. Everyone has a job, gardens, repairs, fishing. It works if everyone does their part." Alina ate slowly, listening. It was strange to think of her parents as part of a community. They had always been private, almost withdrawn. But here, they seemed alive. When her mother mentioned one of the neighbors, a man named Mark, who looked after his elderly parents, something in her voice softened. "He's a good man," May said. "Knows how to fix anything. Keeps us going when the rest of us are too old to climb under the platforms." Later that day, Alina met him. He was mending a wooden walkway, sleeves rolled up, hand steady despite the cold. He looked up when she approached, nodded, and went back to work. His face was lined but kind, his hair sun-bleached. He didn't speak much, but his silence wasn't rude. It was the kind that came from habit, from years of listening more than talking. Over the next few days, she began to learn the rhythm of island life. Mornings were for work, repairing nets, tending the small greenhouse, collecting water in barrels. Afternoons were quiet, filled with the hum of wind turbines and the creak of wood. Evenings brought everyone together, around fires, built in metal drums. They shared soup, bread, stories of storms survived. Alina stayed mostly silent, watching, absorbing. There was something soothing in the repetition, in the way life here seemed stripped of everything unnecessary. At night, when she lay in bed, the island rocked beneath her. Sometimes she could hear Mark moving outside, checking the ropes or adjusting the panels. Once, she saw him from the window, carrying a lantern across the platforms, his shadow stretching over the water like a thread between houses. She wondered what had brought him here. Perhaps the same thing that had brought her. Loss or exhaustion, or a need for quiet so deep that only the lake could understand it. Her body changed with the days. The baby grew heavier, her balance slower. Her mother watched her carefully but never interfered. "The water keeps you steady," May said once, when Alina nearly slipped on a wet board. "It moves, but it doesn't let you fall. That's what you have to learn here." As autumn deepened, the colors around the lake turned dark and rich. The forest on the shore flamed with gold before fading into gray. Mist drifted low over the water each morning, erasing the horizon. The isolation that had frightened Alina at first began to feel like protection. She found herself waking before dawn, sitting by the window, watching the light creep over the surface of the lake. Sometimes she wrote in a notebook, small fragments that came uninvited memories of the city, lines about the smell of rain on wood, about the heartbeat of the island. One evening, her father told her how the island had begun. "We were only 3 families back then," he said, poking at the fire. "People who were tired of noise and rules. We built the first house out of scrap timber from an old dockyard. Every year, we added another platform. It isn't perfect, but it's ours. And when the wind shifts, we shift with it." Alina looked around at the faces in the firelight, her parents, the neighbors, Mark sitting quietly nearby. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like an intruder. The water reflected the flames, turning the lake into a mirror of stars. She wondered if her child would remember any of this, if the rhythm of waves would become the first sound he or she ever knew. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. Wind rattled the glass of her window, and the floating house swayed harder than usual. She felt the familiar unease return, a reminder that the island wasn't anchored to anything solid. But as she lay awake, she began to understand something her father had said long ago. Stability wasn't about stillness. It was about balance. When she finally drifted into sleep, she dreamed of walking across the platforms at dawn, the water smooth and endless beneath her feet. The island seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like a living creature. She felt the child move inside her again, a tiny echo of that same rhythm. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air bright and clean. Her mother was already outside, sweeping fallen leaves off the planks. Her father waved from a small boat, heading toward the shore, and she realized how their lives had folded perfectly into this place, how everything they needed came from the balance between water and wood, silence and effort. Alina stood at the edge of the dock, holding her belly, and felt a strange calm settle over her. For the first time since leaving the city, she wasn't thinking about what she had lost, but about what might still be built. The island was fragile, yes, but so was she, and still she floated. She watched as Mark's house came into view across the narrow channel, a thin line of smoke rising from his chimney. Somewhere inside, a radio was playing faintly, a song she didn't recognize. The sound carried over the water, blending with the cry of distant birds. And as she listened, she felt the island's heartbeat steady beneath her feet, as if it were welcoming her home. The days would grow shorter soon. The lake would freeze around the edges, the storms would come. But for now, there was sunlight on the water, and the warmth of her parents' laughter drifting from the kitchen window. For now, she belonged here. And for the first time in months, that was enough. By the time the first frost appeared on the edges of the platforms, Alina had already learned to move with the water. At first, the constant motion had unsettled her. She had felt it in her sleep, like a whisper beneath her dreams. Now she barely noticed it. The island swayed and breathed, and she swayed and breathed with it. Life here had a rhythm that replaced the mechanical pulse of the city, slower, more deliberate, but no less demanding. Every morning began before sunrise, with the crackle of her father's boots on the wet boards, and the sound of her mother filling the metal buckets with lake water. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the air, mixing with pine and the faint salt of the wind. Alina woke each day to these sounds, the same and yet different, as though the island composed its own song each morning. She had begun helping her mother with the greenhouse. Inside the small structure of glass and salvaged plastic, the air was warm and damp. Herbs hung from the rafters, and the scent of basil and mint filled her lungs as she leaned over to water the soil. Her mother had taught her to plant lettuce in shallow boxes that floated on the water in wooden frames, the plants drawing their life from the lake itself. It amazed Alina that something so fragile could thrive here, between air and water, balanced on nothing solid. Her pregnancy had entered the 7th month. The weight of her belly changed the way she moved, slow but sure, careful on the narrow walkways. Her mother often watched her from a distance, pretending not to worry, though Alina saw the way May's hand sometimes tightened around the railings when her daughter crossed the more unstable planks. There were days when her back ached from carrying water or bending over the plants, and yet she found herself unwilling to stop. Work here was not a burden. It was proof that she still belonged somewhere, that her body, despite its fatigue, was capable of creation. The community around the island functioned like an unspoken agreement. Each family had its role. Old Harold repaired engines, checked fuel lines, and tended to the generator that kept the lights alive. One of the neighbors, a retired teacher, cared for the few children who had been born here, teaching them to read by the dim glow of solar lamps. Others fished or built tools, crafting what they needed from driftwood and memory. No one spoke of ownership. The island belonged to all of them, and in return, they belonged to it. It was Mark who often tied the loose ends of the day together. He seemed to appear wherever there was work, a steady, quiet presence who never raised his voice. Sometimes Alina saw him hauling ropes or replacing boards on one of the far platforms, sleeves rolled to the elbow, face turned against the wind. Other times, he arrived at her parents' house without being called, offering to repair a broken hinge or carry a load of wood. He never lingered after finishing, but he always left something behind: the scent of sawdust, the echo of calm competence, a trace of kindness that needed no explanation. They rarely talked beyond simple things. Once, when she thanked him for fixing the boat motor, he had shrugged. "Everything here breaks sooner or later," he said. "The trick is to fix it before it sinks." She had smiled, thinking he meant the machinery, but the way he looked at her, just for a heartbeat, made her wonder if he understood how the same rule applied to people. Days on the island were measured not by clocks, but by the quality of light. Morning had a pale stillness, noon shimmered gold, and evening brought the blue hush that meant it was time to stop working and listen to the water. Alina began keeping a notebook on the small table by her bed, writing to the child inside her, the pages filled with details she thought no one else would notice. The soft echo of footsteps across a bridge, the hum of wind in the wires, the way sunlight moved through the cracks in the walls. She wanted her child to know the world, not as a list of events, but as a living thing, something that could be heard and felt. There were days when the quiet grew heavy, pressing on her shoulders like the sky before rain. On those days, she walked to the edge of the island, where the platforms met the open lake. The forest across the water seemed endless. Sometimes, she imagined the city beyond those trees, its noise, its lights, its cold anonymity, and felt the same mixture of relief and grief. She no longer missed her husband. The pain had softened, leaving behind only a faint outline, like footprints erased by the tide. What remained was the question of who she was now. Not a wife, not yet a mother, just a woman in between lives, waiting for the water to decide which way she would drift. When November came, the air changed. The light grew sharper, the nights colder. One morning, her father came back from checking the ropes and said the current was shifting. "We'll have to reinforce the chains before the next storm," he said. "Last year, we lost 2 platforms." The community moved like a single body, each person knowing what to do. Mark and Harold worked side by side, tightening bolts, adding new anchors to the lake bed. Alina watched from the walkway, one hand resting on her stomach. The wind was rising, the water darkening. Even the birds seemed uneasy, circling low before disappearing into the trees. That night, rain began to fall. Slow at first, then steady, then furious. It drummed on the roofs, poured down the sides of the greenhouses, soaked the platforms until they shone black under the lantern light. Alina woke to the sound of wind pressing against the walls. Her father was already outside, shouting orders to the others. Mark's voice rose faintly above the storm, calm but urgent. She tried to stand, but her mother held her back. "Stay inside," May said. "They know what to do." Through the window, Alina saw flashes of movement, lanterns swinging, men leaning into the wind to pull at ropes that looked thin as thread against the black water. Waves rose higher than she had ever seen, crashing against the wooden sides. Then came a sound like thunder. One of the chains snapped. Her house lurched violently, the floor tilting as though the world had been lifted from beneath her. For a moment, she thought the entire platform would break apart. She heard her father yell her name. Within seconds, Mark was in the boat, pushing through the waves, his flashlight cutting through the spray. The rain blurred everything, but she could see him fighting the current, guiding the boat toward her drifting platform. He threw a rope, missed, threw again. The wind caught his voice, carried it away. Then, finally, she felt the jolt of the line catching on the railing. Her father appeared beside him, both men pulling with all their strength, their faces ghostly in the light. The boat pitched dangerously, but they didn't stop. Inside the house, the furniture slid across the floor. A pot crashed to the ground. Alina clung to the table, one arm around her belly, whispering to the child without realizing it. The island groaned beneath her, wood straining against water. Then, suddenly, there was stillness. Not quiet, but a pause in motion. The rope held. The platform steadied. When the storm finally passed, it left behind a silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound. The air smelled of metal and rain. The lake, usually calm, still shivered from the violence it had endured. The next morning, everyone gathered to see the damage. One of the greenhouses had collapsed. Half the walkway to the outer platforms was gone. But no one had been hurt. They worked without complaint, clearing debris, salvaging what they could. The rhythm of life resumed, slower but unbroken. Mark was the first to start repairs. He worked long hours, often alone, replacing boards and checking the anchor lines. Alina joined when she could, handing him tools or holding a lantern as daylight faded. They didn't speak much. Words seemed unnecessary. What had happened during the storm had bound them in a way that needed no explanation. Each knew what the other had seen in those moments: fear, exhaustion, and something deeper, something that neither dared name. As the days passed, the storm became memory. The new ropes gleamed with salt. The platform steadied again. But Alina found herself changed. The fragility of what they had built, their homes, their lives, had exposed something inside her that felt raw and essential. She began to understand the strange strength her parents carried, the quiet courage that came from building something that could float instead of stand. She wrote about it that night in her notebook, her handwriting slow and careful. "The island is alive," she wrote. "It breathes with us. It remembers our weight and our mistakes. It forgives what the land never could. Winter crept closer. Frost began to edge the planks in the mornings, and the lake's surface thickened with ice along the shallows. The days shortened until afternoon felt like evening. Yet the island endured, its lights flickering each night like stars fallen to the water. One evening, after finishing repairs, Mark knocked gently on the door. He had brought a basket of supplies, tools, bread, a small jar of honey. Her mother invited him in, and he accepted with the same quiet politeness he always showed. The conversation was simple. The weather, the generator, the new ropes. But beneath the words was an unspoken gratitude, one Alina couldn't express aloud. When he finally rose to leave, she followed him to the door. The air outside was crisp, the lake already catching the reflection of early stars. "Thank you," she said softly. He hesitated, then nodded. "It's what we do," he answered. "We keep things afloat." After he left, she stood there for a long time, watching the path of his lantern as he crossed back to his side of the island. The light moved steadily through the dark, small but unwavering. It reminded her of something her father had once told her, that even a tiny flame could hold its own against the wind if it knew how to bend. Alina went back inside, sat by the window, and placed her hand over her stomach. The baby moved gently, as if answering her thoughts. The storm had tested her, had tested all of them, but the island was still here. So was she. Outside, the wind rose again, whispering across the frozen edges of the lake. But this time, its voice no longer sounded like threat. It sounded like promise. The island breathed, and Alina breathed with it. The storm left behind a new kind of silence, one that settled deep into the wood and the water, as though the island itself needed time to remember how to breathe. Days passed slowly after that, wrapped in the stillness that follows survival. The air grew sharper, the light thinner. Frost spread over the edges of the planks each morning, a delicate lace that crackled underfoot. The lake hardened around the shores, and in the early hours before sunrise, a thin film of ice covered the water like glass. Alina would stand by the window and watch it shimmer, feeling both awe and unease. It was as if the world had paused between seasons, waiting to see if it would move again. Her body had changed with the rhythm of the island. She was heavier now, her steps slower but purposeful. The storm had left her with a new sense of belonging. The way Mark and her father had fought the water to save her home had stitched her to this place more tightly than any decision she could have made. She had seen how the community held together, how every hand, no matter how old or weary, had reached out to keep the island from drifting apart. That image stayed with her, a reminder that survival was not a solitary act. It was something woven between people, in silence, in exhaustion, in shared breath. Inside the house, her parents had grown softer. Her father no longer barked orders the way he used to. His voice carried patience instead of authority. He moved slower, too, his joints stiff from the cold, but he refused to admit it. Her mother busied herself with preparations for the baby, sewing small blankets from scraps of fabric and knitting woolen booties by the fire. Sometimes, when Alina woke in the middle of the night, she found her mother still awake, working by candlelight, the flame trembling with each stroke of her needle. There was something almost sacred in that sight, a mother making warmth for another generation while the world outside froze. The community shrank into itself as winter took hold. Travel to the shore became harder, the boats useless when the lake began to freeze. Those who still had fuel for their generators shared it. Others relied on wood and patience. The nights were long, the kind that pressed down on you until even dreams felt heavy. Yet there was peace in that rhythm, too. Life here had no space for hurry. Alina found herself thinking more often about her child, not as an idea, but as a person she already knew. Sometimes, while sitting near the stove, she would whisper stories about the world outside, about cities with tall buildings and glowing windows, about trains that moved faster than the wind. Other times, she simply hummed without words, the tune rising and falling like the water under the ice. The child always seemed to answer, a kick, a shift, a reminder that life went on, even when everything else seemed still. Mark came often. At first he came with purpose, to check the new chains, to bring supplies, to help her father repair the walkway that had cracked under frost. Later, his visits became quieter, less about work and more about presence. He brought fish when he could catch them, and once, a jar of wild honey he had saved from summer. He stayed for tea, sometimes talking with her parents, sometimes sitting silently by the fire, watching the flames reflect on the glass of the windows. His silences had become familiar to Alina. They were the kind that didn't need to be filled. The wind outside grew stronger as winter deepened. At night, it howled across the lake like something alive. The ice groaned, expanding and contracting with the cold, and the sound traveled through the wood like distant thunder. It should have been frightening, but Alina found comfort in it. The island was talking in its own way, reminding her that movement still existed beneath the stillness. One morning, the cold arrived with a sharpness that took her breath away. Frost formed even on the inside of the windows, and when she spoke, her voice came out in clouds. Her father had gone to check the generator before dawn, but he returned early, his eyebrows dusted with ice. "The fuel's running low," he said. "We'll ration what's left." Her mother nodded, already lighting another lantern. They all knew what that meant. Longer nights, dimmer light, more silence. Alina didn't mind. She found a strange beauty in the austerity of it. The absence of excess made every small comfort precious. A cup of warm tea, a spark in the fireplace, the sight of smoke curling upward into the frozen sky. Even her mother's old stories told in the half-light felt warmer now. Weeks passed. The ice thickened around the platforms, holding them in place. The island no longer floated freely, but rested, bound by the season. The days blurred into each other, the light always faint, as though the sun were too tired to rise fully. Alina's belly grew heavier, her movements slower. She spent hours near the window, watching the faint traces of smoke rise from the neighbors' chimneys. The small signs of life, a curtain moving, a lantern being lit, reassured her that she was not alone in this frozen world. One evening, when the air was heavy with the scent of burning pine, her mother looked at her with quiet concern. "You should rest more," she said. "The baby will come soon." Alina nodded, though she could feel that rest was impossible. Her body ached constantly, as if every part of her had been rewired to prepare for what was coming. There was anticipation, yes, but also a calm certainty. The island had taught her that nature never rushed, only waited until the right moment. That moment came on a night thick with snow. The storm outside was not as violent as the one before, but it carried a deeper cold, one that crept through the smallest cracks. The wind moaned like a distant voice. Alina woke before dawn, her breath uneven. The first pain came softly, almost politely, a tightening deep within her. She sat up, listening, half expecting it to pass. But then it returned, stronger, unmistakable. Her mother, already light sleeper that she was, heard her move and came instantly. One look at Alina's face was enough. "It's time," she said, and called for Harold. Panic never entered the room. Everything happened with quiet purpose. Her father lit the lanterns, added more wood to the stove. May prepared towels and water, her hands sure despite the tremor of age. When Harold stepped outside to fetch Mark, the cold hit him like glass, but he didn't hesitate. Within minutes, Mark appeared, breath clouding in the frigid air, his coat dusted with snow. "The ice is too thick for the boat," he said, his voice steady. "If we need the medic, I'll go on foot across the shore." But there was no time for that now. Inside, the small house became its own world. The storm howled outside. The ice groaned, and within those walls, life began to fight its way into being. Hours passed, in a blur of pain and focus. Alina's mother whispered to her between contractions, old words of comfort that she barely remembered from her own childhood. Mark moved in and out of the room, bringing hot water, firewood, anything that was needed. Her father sat nearby, hands clasped, face pale but steady. Then, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the child arrived, a boy, red and furious and alive. His cry filled the air, sharp and defiant, cutting through the storm like a beacon. May laughed through her tears, wrapping him in one of the quilts she had made. Harold wiped his face with his sleeve, murmuring something that sounded like a prayer. Elina, exhausted, could only watch as her son opened his eyes, as if testing the world he had entered. She felt the last of the pain fade, replaced by a stillness so deep it felt holy. Outside, the wind calmed, the snow eased, and the lake glimmered under the faint morning light. It was as though the island itself had been waiting for this. The birth, the proof that life continued even here, where everything seemed suspended between sky and water. The days after his birth unfolded like a dream. The island grew quiet again, wrapped in the rhythm of care. Her mother stayed by her side, her father tending the fire. Mark came often, never staying long, always bringing something. Fish, clean water, small gifts carved from wood. Once, he left a cradle he had built himself, simple but sturdy, its edges smoothed with care. He said nothing when he set it down, only met her eyes for a moment, then turned to leave. But in that silence was everything she understood about him, his patience, his kindness, his quiet belief that care was its own form of love. As spring approached, the ice began to retreat. It didn't melt all at once, but in pieces, cracking softly during the afternoons. Water pooled between the planks, and soon the island floated again. The first birds returned, their cries echoing across the lake. One morning, Elina stood on the dock with her son in her arms and watched the water move. The reflections of the trees shimmered, and she realized how much she had changed since she first arrived. The woman who had come here, broken and uncertain, no longer existed. In her place stood someone quieter, but stronger, rebuilt by storms, anchored by love that needed no words. When Mark approached, she turned and smiled. He had been working on a new platform near the outer edge of the settlement, a larger one, built to last through the next winter. "It's ready," he said simply. She followed him across the walkways, the baby sleeping against her chest. The new platform was solid beneath her feet, the boards fresh, the railings smooth. "For you," Mark said, "and for him." She didn't speak. There was nothing to add. The sound of the water lapping against the new wood said enough. Her parents joined them a little later, standing quietly, faces lit with pride and relief. Together they looked out across the lake. The ice was gone, the surface alive again, carrying the reflection of the sky. Elina felt the island's motion under her feet, gentle, rhythmic, certain. Her son stirred in her arms and opened his eyes, blinking at the light. She whispered something she didn't mean for anyone else to hear. "We're home." The wind rose softly, carrying the scent of pine and thawed earth. Somewhere across the water, the other families were stirring, their laughter faint but bright. The island creaked and shifted, finding its balance again. It had survived the storm, the cold, the waiting. And so had she. As the sun climbed higher, light spread over the lake, breaking through the clouds. Elena stood still, holding her son close, and watched the ripples form, small circles widening into one another, touching everything around them. The island floated, alive, its chains steady but loose enough to let it move. It didn't need to be fixed to the ground to belong. Neither did she. She looked toward Mark, then toward her parents, and finally at the water. The reflection of the sky rippled across its surface, bright and endless. The island that stayed afloat had taught her the one truth she hadn't known she was searching for: that even in motion, even without anchor, a life could be whole. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful true stories. Keep watching. The next video is waiting for you right here. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share this video with them today.